Hello, everyone. So I had some people last time I was on streaming wanted to know if I was going to do a review of Ravnica Allegiance or not. I guess because I did that last time for Guilds of Ravnica, that went over very well. And I do like doing reviews. I think everybody does. Everyone has an opinion on every Magic card ever made, it feels like. And truth be told, I wasn't 100% sure I was going to do a full set review. And I thought about it. I said, you know what? Let's not do a full set review, but let's do my top 10. So I thought I'd take it a different way, not just the top 10 cards I expect you're going to see, like the most, I guess, tournament or competitive play necessarily. But what I wanted to do was kind of look at cards that I think stand out a little bit. I think there's some that I agree with a lot of people are talking about. There's also a bunch that I haven't heard much about that I think are going to have a little bit of an impact. So I think this would be kind of a fun way for me to do a top 10. This is similar to if any of you guys listen to the game podcast with Gottlieb and I don't know why I'm forgetting the other guy's name with Jerry Thompson. Actually, they do kind of their own top 10 lists, and I think that's the way a lot of us should be doing it. I mean, it's not just about what's the most competitive or not at any given time. A lot of times it's just simply what do we think are going to be the most fun? What do we think are going to see play in Commander? What do we think are just our favorite cards? I think a lot of times when people come on and watch you, they want to see that stuff. So let's get into it and talk about some Allegiance cards. So for starters, there was no way I wasn't going to talk about this card. I think any of you who've been watching me on stream for the past couple of months know that I've been really looking forward to some of the Gruul cards. So this was kind of a slam dunk gimme that I was going to put it on my list. The thing is, though, I don't know if it's actually that powerful. But at the same time, I think the way Wizards has gone lately with Planeswalkers, barring Teferi, obviously, is that they're good, but they're not necessarily game breaking or game winning. You know, they have some abilities you can kind of build around a little bit, which is pretty cool. But I don't know if this is one of those things like you draw it and now your opponent's like paranoid it's on the table. However, breaking it down, it is only a 4 cost, which isn't bad. The downside is right now, though, I think the way the format may shape up, especially in Standard, is that Gruul has a lot of quality 4 mana spells, right? Like, so you've got probably Nullhide Ferox, which is going to be the most popular. You've got Domri if you want to try to squeeze it in. You've even still got stuff like Ripjaw Raptor, which are all going to be, I mean, there's so many choices once you get to 4, 5, 6 mana. I think that's going to be the real problem with this card, is how many do you play among playing everything else? And then you have the other factor, if you're playing something like Nullhide Ferox, then you kind of get caught in a spot where Domri now becomes 6. That can be somewhat mitigated if you're playing more mana creatures or whatever to build up to, 6, 7, 8 mana to maybe play some Expel on the back end. Because right now, some of us were also playing things like just random, X burn spells to kill your opponent at the end. You weren't really playing or conserving mana for anything important, which is, good and bad. However, though, I think Allegiance does alleviate some of that, as there's a lot of cards with Adapt and different things that have activations, and we'll get to some of that later, that can use some of that mana you'd be building up. And we haven't really had that yet, so having a good mana sink could be very cool. But anyway, back to Domri himself. The first line of getting red or green mana is actually pretty relevant because it does allow you to go Domri on 4. If you play an additional land, that's 5. Get a mana from Domri, that's 6. So you can jump from 4 to 6 quickly on the next turn. So some of your turns could be turn 1 Llanowar Elf, turn 2 cast a 3 mana thing, turn 4 or turn 3 cast Domri, then turn 5 cast, I don't know, Carnage Tyrant. So it's gonna be hard to try to figure out like the best way he slots in with the extra mana. The one thing people look at a lot of times with Planeswalkers, though, is does the card have the ability to defend itself? In this case, technically no, but at the same time, you are playing it likely in a creature-heavy deck, so you probably have some creatures out in front of it. Additionally, it does have 5 loyalties. So if you do activate the first ability, you're at 6. I mean, your opponent would have to have 6 damage that you can't stop or get in front of or anything to kill Domri. Now, the downside generally could be a situation where you do go up to 6, you have a blocker, your opponent attacks with a couple of things, and then maybe now you can't actually use their second ability. So you have to go back to adding a mana to get another loyalty, and kind of you're in that little loop, which is interesting. The other ability is a -3, so you're not going to get to activate it very often. But when you do, it's one of the few ways that red and green are going to have to be able to get extra cards. I think that's one of the things that can be concerning about the future builds of Gruul, is that you're going to have a lot of big guys. You're going to have haste guys because of the Riot ability. Which, by the way, with his first ability, Riot does stack. I'm not sure everybody's aware of that, but you can have 2 instances of Riot, which means you can get 2 +1/+1s, or you can get a +1/+1 and attack with haste. I mean, there's some different options there. But if you are loading your deck with creatures, it's not going to be too difficult to get at least 1. How often you're going to get 2, that's a different story. I mean, you're looking at a lot of cases where you're not going to get 2 creatures. So is that worth it to be able to just look at the top cards, get 1? Do you play this alongside Vivian Reed to almost practically guarantee you at least get a card, because Vivian lets you get a land? Or do you play both of them and then you're getting 2 or 3 creatures a turn into your hand? Like, there's going to be a lot of interesting situations and builds. I mean, it's almost weird to be able to say that in some ways you can play a red-green base Super Friends style deck in the new standard. So I don't know. I mean, I appreciate that what you're going to see through this whole top 10 is that Allegiance is actually bringing a lot of cards that are going to shape the format in a lot of different ways. I think what we've gotten used to as far as the decks from the last 3 months are not going to be things that we can play the same. You know, even now I'm talking about, like, what are the quality of the planeswalkers? Like, all 3 of them in the set function and play completely differently than any of the others that we've seen. And I don't know if you necessarily have to build around them, or if they're just good additions to other things you're doing. I mean, and that's just like the tip of the iceberg on this set. I think we were a little bit concerned that we've been sitting in one of the best standard formats in years. Probably one of the top 5 all-time standard formats. Right? If you just look at deck diversity, number of cards that are getting played that are available. You know, and it's great because this is happening with just 5 sets available to build from. But going forward, we're kind of concerned with, like, okay, is this going to be the same? Are we really going to get a lot out of Allegiance? What's it going to do for us? But as it turns out, I think Allegiance is really going to shake things up, which is pretty sweet. Our next card on the list, Growth Chamber Guardian. And don't worry, I'm not doing all red and green cards. I do have others on the list. But Growth Chamber Guardian is interesting because I think it's both flown under the radar a little bit for people, but it's also been a very talked about card on some streams as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if this card ends up being one of the more expensive rares in the set. It's very unassuming, just being a 2/2 for 2. But that in and of itself is fine, you know, because there's other cards that are able to put +1/+1 counters on it. There's, you know, like we just saw with Domri, there's cards that give cards Riot. So you can play it, and again, it's that way for a green deck or green base deck to be able to go draw extra cards. In this case, you just go get more copies of Growth Chamber Guardian. And being able to turn it into a 4/4 is a relevant thing. So, and in all reality, many times you're probably going to have it be a 5/5. If you found some way to give it Riot or put a counter on it, and then you've adapted to put 2 more counters on it. So, oh, actually, you can't do that. So you'd only be able to do it a 4/4 because if you decide to Riot, he's stuck at a 3/3 because you can't adapt if you have counters. So if you have something to remove counters, then you'll be able to get them bigger. But again, you know, even if you're just getting a pile of 3/3 creatures, that's still more than acceptable. The other thing that's cool too is, again, where we're talking about having all that extra mana and no way to spend it a lot of times in the creature deck, this gives you kind of a combat trick that you can attack and your opponent has to decide where it's best to block, where you might spend that extra mana to put a couple of counters on this guy. it's really interesting, and it is an elf and a warrior. I don't think Dana Crab's all that relevant, but I do appreciate that they're letting Simic kind of play around and really go deep on all the different creature types together. But in this case, you're looking at something that's an elf and a warrior that fits in a few different builds that exist out there, not just in standard. I don't know if this is good enough to be something in modern or whatnot. I don't think those decks are necessarily looking for a 3/3 4/4 creature, but it's an option. It's something that's there. And I think a lot of those things can't be overlooked when you're deck building. A lot of times I think creative deck building starts with looking at all the things that are available to you and then kind of going from there. But, if you guys give me just one quick second here, I need to make an adjustment. Sorry about that. Kind of looking at some of my options here and want to make sure we're getting some clear sound. So there we go. Hopefully that sound will be a little bit clearer for you. We're going to clear that up some. So hopefully that works. So on Growth Chamber Guardian, I think this is probably one of the better early plays that any of the green-based decks are really going to have, because you're either playing mana creatures, you had stuff that already existed like Thorn Lieutenant. There's the new Gruul Riot 2/2 creature, but I don't know if that's good enough to play. Like, it's definitely not good enough to play over this. I'd argue that it's not better to play over Thorn Lieutenant, so those are probably your two best 2-drops. There are others that make mana that are still acceptable, and there's even one more in this set, but I think this is probably going to be your card of choice. And it also has some late game benefits. You're drawing a 4/4, really, you're not just drawing a 2/2. And not only that, you're drawing a 4/4 that lets you go get another one. And that has a huge late game impact. Okay, like I said, not all Gruul cards, but this one definitely is. And this one kind of caught my eye in a very interesting way, because it was interesting that R&D felt the need to put a pile of fight cards in this set. And I'm not sure if that is a signal to anything, if that's something they just felt we really needed in limited play. But there are 3 or 4 different cards that have some type of fight ability, which is very peculiar, because normally you get 1 in a set, sometimes 2, but it's rare that you get as many as we got. This, though, with Thrash Threat, first side is 2 mana, split green-red mana for both. It's an instant, and it lets your creature deal damage equal to its power to a creature or planeswalker you don't control. The cool part about this is it's one of the few ways creature decks will, or if you're creature heavy, will have to actually target a planeswalker. And you get to do it at instant speed. So what this means is that, on those turns where you have a creature or two, your opponent goes, plays something like Teferi, when they go to activate Teferi's ability, either one they choose, you can now target Teferi to try to kill it. Or at least get Teferi small enough that maybe an elf can finish it off and you can keep sending damage at your opponent. It's also a way, because normally the fight cards aren't at instant speed. A lot of them, there's a few, but a lot of times they're at sorcery speed. This being an instant is really cool because it's a really interesting combat trick. In cases where maybe you already have a creature that's going to die because of how your opponent blocked, maybe you have it fight another smaller thing, and then it gets finished off in the combat and takes something else out. It's also possible that maybe you can use that creature to clear the way for something else that has trample to get a couple of damage through. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And the other side is just make a 4/4 for 4. With trample, mind you, but it's a very good, just solid late game draw. Like, sometimes you just need that thing to push forward a little bit. Like, this is a totally relevant card for both early and late game. I think this is the type of card that you want when you're doing some of those arena runs, when you're trying to play ladder matches and you're just playing best of one. These are the type of cards you're looking for. Like, right now in the deck I'm playing in ladder, I've got Savage Stomp. Like, that's a fine card. I'm playing enough dinosaurs that the card is good. But if I were to have this as an option, I will definitely play this over Savage Stomp. Even though it's 1 more mana, like, the fact that it's an instant, the fact that it hits planeswalkers, and if I'm in a situation where I don't have a creature that I can actually fight with, I can just make a 4/4. So this does a lot of stuff that the other fight cards don't. And just having that option and the flexibility, I think, is huge. And that came up on a lot of cards in this set. I think there was some development put in that included how is this card going to work in Arena? Like, how is this going to work with deck builds in the future? Are we going to still have best of one in ladder matches? Like, if people are playing best of one, they're going to want more options and want stuff to be a little more flexible. So if I won't say, I mean, not conspiracy theorying it up or anything, but obviously it makes sense that people at Wizards are going to try to consider all elements of how you're playing Magic and make the cards work for all of them. So I think this is just in line with that. And I would expect to see more of this type of development in the future, where cards are doing 2 different things, maybe 3 things. And just having that flexibility also lets cards fit into more deck types, which is very cool. Going down our list. Okay, see, I told you, not all Gruul cards. Here's a different one. We've got an Orzhov card. It's 2 colorless, a white and a black. It's a 4/3 flying angel. You can pay 1 to give it vigilance. You can pay 1 white, and you can pay 1 black to give it death touch. And it has afterlife too. The main reason this card made my list is that I've been surprised how many people aren't talking about it. I think there's been a few people that looked and said, well, why is this a mythic? In reality, well, first off, I want to say the art on this card is flipping gorgeous. Like, it is probably my favorite card in the set. If not, it's one of my top 2. Like, this would be cool to have on a playmat or as a background on your computer or whatever. Like, the art's just gorgeous. But, thinking about it from an aggro player side, because I play a lot of creature decks, this is exactly the type of card you don't want to see on the other side of the table. Like, it's 4 power, which means it's probably going to block and or kill a significant number of the creatures you may be attacking with. It is 3 toughness, which lets you at least punch through it a little bit. But the fact that it can gain death touch means it's going to get to kill whatever it wants in combat. And then when it dies, you now have 2 more blockers that you have to punch through. This is exactly the card I would think a lot of the slower control decks or any of the Orzhov decks or whatever are going to want against some of these heavy aggro green-white, maybe, or green-red, or maybe even Teamer style decks. That this is going to be a good card against them. And then worst case scenario, if the ground's gummed up, you just have a 4 power flyer that you can pay 1 and have vigilance and just keep swinging every turn. So this is a very interesting card, and I think it's stronger than people want to give it credit for. The other funny thing is, too, I mean, there was a point in time in Magic, granted, because I'm playing for so long, but if we had a 4 power 4/3 that had multiple abilities on it, we'd have been ecstatic. In this case, for 4 mana, you're getting a 4 power creature with flying, with the ability to have vigilance, with the ability to have death touch, and then when it dies, you happen to get 2 more 1/1 flyers. Like, there's a lot in this card for 4 mana. Now, do I think it's like, if I'm playing Orzhov, I have to play this? Probably not. It's not mandatory in any way. But it is a really, really, really strong card. It's definitely not one to be overlooked. I think it's going to be pretty scary. It's the type of card that, knowing my opponent has access to those colors, I'm probably going to be a little slower about using a lava coil on something, because that's going to likely be one of the few ways I have to target this. It's great if I have Thrash Threat and can fight something, but then I still have 2 more creatures to contend with. And depending on the state of the board, those 2 creatures could be the difference between you attacking through to win or not. So this card is very interesting, and I think it's one of those things that's, I don't know if it's necessarily great in multiples. I mean, it's not bad. You have another 4/3 flyer, but then you're kind of managing your mana around, like, okay, do I want to save mana for death touch? Do I want to give it vigilance? Do I want to spend the mana on my other one to give it death touch? And that's going to limit your spells you can play. But even just one of these on the board is actually going to be something sizable for your opponent with creatures on the ground to really deal with. Like, I really like this card a lot. I'm really surprised more people aren't talking about it. And who knows? Like I said, it may end up becoming nothing, but I could see a world where people are playing blue, black, white as an aggro deck. Because of cards like this, because of the new Dovin, Like, I don't think necessarily, the colors we got used to just being control colors are going to continue being only control colors. I think, we've kind of cracked that nut a little bit, and now we're diving in and looking at new ideas. Like, there's going to be a lot of ways you can play each of the colors in each of the decks. I think it's been easy to take some of that for granted, but I think cards like this start to change that a little bit. Speaking of Dovin, here we are. I think almost everybody who's done a top 10 list of any kind, again, this is just cards I find the most interesting out of the set, more than what I think are the most powerful, but this one probably falls on a lot of people's top 10 lists. For 3 mana, a white, a blue, and a colorless, you get 3 loyalty, which is fine. I think everybody's first thought is when you get a 3 mana planeswalker, how good is it? Because, we rarely get those. Though I say that, we got Sarkin not long ago, and he's just now coming into his own. So it took people a while to figure that one out. But, I think when you think back to Liliana and Jace and whatnot and how good those were, I think people just assume that 3 mana planeswalkers are automatically going to be just as popular. But in this case, his first ability says, until end of turn, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put a loyalty counter on Dovin, which is actually pretty cool, because it's a way to ramp up his loyalty. So if you even have, like we're saying with last turn, if you have the Seraph and it dies and you attack with a couple of the flyers, well, now you put 2 counters on Dovin, and now he's significantly larger. So could he be in a blue-white aggro deck of some sort? Maybe. You could be playing a blue-white Flyers deck of some sort. I don't know, like turn 1 Healer's Hawk, or any of the 1-drops that are in the mono blue deck, possibly. And something else on 2, then Dovin on 3, push Dovin to 5. Actually, I guess he would go to 6, actually, because you get 1 just from the activation, go to 4. You attack with your 2 creatures, he goes up to 6. It's not likely whatever creature your opponent has, even if you don't leave yourself any blockers, would even be able to kill Dovin, because 6 loyalty on turn 3 for your opponent's attack is actually pretty big. So that alone lets him protect himself. Then his other ability is cool because it's only a -1. It feels like it probably should have been -2, but creating a Thopter and then gaining a life is pretty big, because let's say you don't have that good start with your 1-drop, 2-drop Dovin. Like, well, now you can just drop it, and he can protect himself. And you get a bonus life, even if somehow they kill it, get through it, still attack Dovin. So you're going to get something out of the activation regardless. Worst case scenario, you look at it as Dovin being 3 mana, you make a Thopter, maybe they spend a shock on Dovin. Worst case scenario, you got a 1/1 creature, you gained a life, and he prevented 2 damage from going to your dome. So that's still pretty good for 3 mana, even if he does nothing else. And then his last ability, it's interesting because it's not like a win the game type ultimate ability. But you get to look at the top 10 cards of your library, you put 3 of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So you will be getting the best of the next 10 cards constantly, which is going to be hard for your opponent to overcome. I mean, let's be real about it. Like, if I'm sitting across the table, my opponent looks at 10 cards, unless he's low on mana or stuck on mana for some reason, that's going to be a bit of a problem, but it's not game over. I mean, there's, you may still have your Carnage Tyrant or, whatever, like some other big threat that they're going to have trouble dealing with that you can still punch through. So I don't think it's game ending, but it definitely adds that level of oppression that you would be getting real close to it being game ending. So it's a pretty sweet card all around. I think it's well done. It's well balanced. Again, I think it plays a little differently. I think it opens Azorius to being played more possibly as an aggro-ish deck or a mid-range deck, not so much as a control deck. It does play okay alongside other planeswalkers, but I don't think this necessarily goes in a deck with Teferi. When you're looking at Teferi is generally in decks that are control-based. They don't have a lot of creatures, so you won't get the benefits of Dovin's ability realistically. So the good news is they don't likely show up together. It's not to say they can't, because again, if I'm playing this type of deck anyway, and I don't have necessarily something on the upper end, I might still just play Teferi. I mean, worst case scenario,
getting a card every turn, untapping some lands, or using Teferi is almost like a way to control the battlefield to just keep putting creatures, the biggest threat, back on top of my opponent's library, or back into my opponent's library. So, I don't know. It's I appreciate, though, that I don't know exactly what my opponents are going to be doing just because I see blue-white lands on their side of the table. I think that's something that right now you're kind of like, oh, you see it, you know there are only one or two things happening. But this actually opens the door to a lot of other options, which I love. Okay, so took a break from Gruul cards and we got another one. And I will say, I think personally, Gruul cards so far in this set are, well, I mean, now that we know the whole list, are probably as a unit the best guild in the set. As far as individual, well, I won't say individual, because there's some individual cards from the other guilds that are as strong or stronger in a lot of cases. But I think if we were to take them as a package deal and say, okay, if these were the only cards you could play with, and we just line the cards up set to set, Gruul probably wins this one. But this card, so it's Rhythm of the Wild is 1 colorless, 1 green, 1 red, for an enchantment. Creature spells you control can't be countered. And non-token creatures you control have Riot. And the funny thing is, I think if either line of text on this card existed, the card is probably still playable. Now, I don't think it's great, but I think there's spots I could find for either one, if either of those abilities are on there. The fact that you get both is really, really good. I mean, with Llanowar, if it's very possible that if this card is legit and things work out the way a lot of people are predicting they will, something as simple as Llanowar Elf is going to become one of the most powerful cards in Standard. Where a turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Rhythm really opens you up for all kinds of plays going into turn 3. Because now any of your 4 mana guys that are likely 4 or 5 power can come and play and just attack. They can come into play as 5/5s or 6/6s. And the fact that your opponent can't counter any of these is huge. I mean, it's tough because granted, I'm not the biggest fan of spell counters. I do think in some ways it can limit some of kind of just how the game plays and what's going on. But at the same time, this is huge. You can take away some decks' abilities to interact. Whereas generally that's kind of the goal of the control player. They're trying to keep you from getting your stuff on the table, keep you from playing your spells, keep you from playing your strategy. But here, you kind of get to turn the tables a little bit. It's also interesting too that if you have the ability to play this on 2 or 3, do I want to play this or do I want to play one of my other creatures? I don't really know. I mean, you're going to have to really read the texture of the board because this card is very strong. And what I like about it is it's not dead if you play it main deck, right? Again, what we were talking about earlier with cards doing double duty and having the ability to do multiple things, this is one of those cases where, okay, the first line's really powerful, but if I happen to just be playing against some other aggro deck, well, the second line's still relevant, right? Turning all my creatures 1 power bigger can definitely turn the combat. It's almost like getting to cast creatures a turn up the ladder each turn. Or if you get a cool creative scenario, you're like, okay, cool. Maybe your opponent overextends. You play 2 or 3 2-mana creatures and still can punch through with haste along with the other guys on the board, and then that's a win. So Riot on everything is really going to change the way games play out. I'll be interested to see how this card reacts the first time we see it on camera in a couple of matches, because not necessarily particularly because of the abilities themselves, but because I'll be interested to see how each player is valuing the Riot ability in the early development of the format. Because I don't think a lot of us have considered, well, what if all my creatures had haste? Or whatever. Or if I don't want them to have haste, I just get to add something to them, and make them bigger. There's going to be some things that are going to be really fun, I think, just to see. And some of that, I think, too, is just learning the format a little bit as we go along and watching things change. This is a card that just feels nuts to me. I will. Okay, so for 2 mana, you get a human cleric, which again, popular tribes, so they could go in other decks and older formats. You can tap it, sacrifice 2 other creatures, any number of target players, which makes this good in Commander. They each lose 2 life and sacrifice a creature. And as a bonus, you get 2 black mana and draw a card. And it's a 1/2 creature. So we'll say, for 2 mana, you're getting a 1/2, so you're not really going to block or fight many things. So you're getting a smaller than average creature. That's fine because you're getting a bunch of abilities. And it's funny because I think you can read through this and it looks like one big ability, but there's actually multiple things happening here. Like, first off, because of the Orzhov cards in this deck and the Afterlife and whatnot, sacrificing creatures isn't necessarily bad. And you do have some creatures that recur themselves from the graveyard, so that's another element you could lean in. So you get to sacrifice some creatures, which may or may not be actually that big of a detriment to you, depending on what you're playing. Then your opponents have to sacrifice a creature, and they lose 2 life. So it's a way to trigger Spectacle. If you're playing any of the Rakdos stuff that has Spectacle, you can make your opponent lose life. That's pretty cool. Your opponents have to sacrifice a creature, so you're getting to kind of force them to keep up with you. And again, if you have Afterlife stuff, you sacrifice your creatures, you get some Afterlife tokens, your spirit tokens, then your opponent's sacrificing creatures, and you still have more to block with. And then, for some unknown reason, you get 2 mana and draw a card. So it's possible that if you play this on 2, turn 3, you play 1 or 2 other creatures, assuming you didn't play anything on 1. You can sacrifice those things, get your Afterlife tokens. Your opponent loses the 1, possibly, or 1/2 of the things they actually have on the table at that point. They're going to lose life. You're going to get 2 more black mana, and you're going to draw a card. So you can possibly play an additional card that turn, just getting ahead, still have extra creatures out to do this again the next turn, and then your opponent set back a creature and some life, and behind a card because you're plus a card. It's like, this card has a ton going on with it, and I don't even know the best way to use it yet. I haven't even started making deck lists with it. I don't know what that's going to look like, but it's an exciting card. I mean, it's one that, if your opponent's allowed to keep it, and it goes unchecked for more than 2 turns, you're probably going to end up in trouble. Like, you get pressured into a situation where you have to try to win as fast as you can, or else the advantages this card creates are just going to pile up. Like, it's a single card that creates a creature advantage, a mana advantage, card advantage, all out of one card for 2 mana. Like, this card is sweet. I don't know if it gets played in older formats, but I feel like it can if you're choosing to build around it and have it be a key part of your build. Electro Dominance. I don't know how everybody else feels about this card. I've listened to some other people's top 10s. I've seen some people talk about stuff, and this card's only been mentioned a couple of times. And truth be told, I think it's pretty sweet. The fact that we have an instant X-Spell is big. There's a lot of times that you get caught with other ones, but they're sorceries, so your opponent gets to kind of wait, see you tap out a bunch of mana or whatever. This way, especially if you're playing against somebody who's waiting to send their mana, they want to counter something, it's like, well, alright, you don't do anything with your turn, they're going to go ahead and tap out and play something like Chemister's Insight. Well, when they go to do that, then you can tap and say, okay, take 4, take 6, whatever. That's pretty cool. But the other benefit is that you also get to play a spell without paying its mana cost equal to X. So, anyway, just to read it out loud here. So it's 2 red and X. Instant. Deals X damage to any target. And then you can cast a card with converted mana cost X or less from your hand without paying its cost. So it's very possible that during your opponent's end step, you could play this to try to blast them for 4, then it goes through and great. Then you get to play a 4/4 creature and get to attack on the next turn. So there's that alone is pretty cool, but it may not even be a thing that works just for creature decks. I mean, it lets you play any spell. So it's possible that there are some decks out there that, okay, maybe you only really need to cast this for 2 or for 3. So it can double as a finisher, but also way to sneak cards into play. Or let you remove a creature and still get a creature into play. I mean, because I think that's one of the other plays too, that when your opponent goes to do something, you can kill their creature and make a blocker, and you can do this even all during combat. So there's a ton of things happening here. Like, this card is really sweet. I don't think it's going to be really expensive. You know, at best, this is probably, as we go along, maybe a $3 or $4 card, realistically, by the end of the format. But I am really digging it. Like, I'm going to try to play a couple of these early on just to see how it works out, because I think there are a lot of options here. I also like that when those games go long and you think your opponent has like one spell counter, but you're not sure, like, you can try to use it during their end step to force them to spend mana, then do something on your turn. And it's a very threatening card, because not only is it the damage they're concerned with, but it's what spell are you going to play along with it. You know, and that's pretty cool. Going down our list here, we have Terramander. And this is one that at first I kind of was glossing over this card and didn't give it a lot of thought. I was like, alright, it's cool. It's a 1/1 flyer. You pay 7, adapt, becomes a 5/5. It costs 1 less for each instant sorcerer in your graveyard. Then I started thinking a little more that we already have decks that are willing to play some bad, well, I say bad, some mediocre 1-drop creatures, right? In the mono blue deck. Because they play like the Siren Storm Tamer, the Unblockable Merfolk, you know. So this is right on par with those for the most part. You're 1 mana for a 1/1 with evasion, you know, as the fact that it flies. But the cool part is, this card can become a 5/5 very cheaply in the right decks. Like, I would not be surprised to see something like is it Phoenix decks? Or even something, well, either version, the way you build it, whether it's with Phoenixes or you're just playing Drakes, they're already loading up the graveyard with stuff. So being able to play this and make a 5/5 for probably just 3 mana or 4 mana is like amazing. You know, this is a great card. And you can activate the ability whenever you want. So you don't necessarily even have to spend the mana initially. You can just play it, let it be a 1/1, kind of let things shape up, see how it's working out, spend your mana to put other stuff in the yard, and then boom, you got a 5/5. So this is the card I think many people were just glossing over, but it might actually have competitive play implications. You know, maybe other decks become built around it. You know, the interesting thing is it's a Simic card, mostly because it has Adapt, and I guess because it's a Salamander Drake, because no other guild's going to have that mix. But I don't think this is necessarily a card that goes in Simic decks. Now, I say that with the caveat that if you find a way to play something that wants to play all the best Adapt cards, then yeah, this probably goes in there. But this is likely in some type of Izzet style deck that we've been seeing. It's possible that it goes into some other type of decks that's splashing maybe white also. That's an aggro flyer evasive deck of some sort. But it's a card I'm definitely gonna be wary of. You know, like the fact that your opponent late game can just have I mean, it's possible this is late in the game just gonna be a 2 mana 5/5 flyer, which is great because it still leaves your mana open to do other stuff later in the game. So even if you're still stuck at just 4 or 5 mana, playing this card still leaves your mana open to do other things that are relevant. Like, this is a real card. Like, it looks very unassuming, which credit to R&D, because I appreciate cards like that on the surface you can look at it and go, this is okay, I guess, if I just have to play a creature, eventually I turn it into a 5/5, not realizing that you're rarely going to pay probably more than 3 mana to activate this. You know, that's not that unreal. So, and there's a bunch of times this is going to just 2 total mana to get you a 5/5 creature. Like, this Terramander, it's definitely one, like I said, it made my list because of the fact that it's so unassuming and that people haven't put a lot of time and thought into it yet. But this card could be very, very, very good. Like, I would really expect to see this card take off at some point during the season. I don't know if it'll be a staple that's just there forever. Maybe people start finding ways to ping creatures because so many people are playing Adapt. Like, I don't know. Maybe stuff that gives things -1/-1 are a problem for it. But in general, I think the card and the artwork's really freaky cool. It's kind of, almost as Simic should be. Just putting the crazy traits of different cards together. But so, it's it out of the park in every way. It's a very, very cool card. Yeah, and then this guy. This guy, I've been big on this card since it first got previewed. I think this is one of the better creatures in the set. Though I have to admit, the more I think about Growth Chamber Guardian, that may be changing a little bit. But for me, Gruul Spellbreaker is very cool. It's 1 colorless, 1 green, 1 red, 3/3, has Riot, has Trample, and when it's your turn, you and Gruul Spellbreaker both have Hexproof. That's a lot of lines of text for 3 mana. So again, this is one of those cards that at 3 mana, if this was 3/3 Riot, that's pretty good. Not necessarily great, but it's playable. You add either of the other 2 abilities to it, and it's really good. You get all the abilities, and it's pretty spectacular. I would assume that if somebody's playing red-green creature-based deck of some kind, and again, I'm talking about whether that's Gruul, whether that's Teamer, whatever, this card probably has to be on the list. Worst case scenario, if your opponent already has something in the way or something you're afraid you're going to have trouble punching through, it's a 4/4 for 3 mana with Trample and has the option of kind of limiting your opponent's spells on your turn. And there's not a lot of things your opponents are doing, but, if they wanted to spend mana at end of turn to, and say in the red decks, maybe you make this guy a 5/5 because it's too hard for them, or 4/4 because it's too hard for them to kill, without having to spend a Lava Coil on their turn to get rid of it, or in some way 2-for-1 you. So they decide, all right, end of turn, I'm going to go ahead and shoot you for 3 with the Lightning Strike and whatever. Well, that's no longer an option for them. They have to start doing everything on their turn before they get rid of this card. You can't get Settle the Wreckage, which is awesome. And I want to take a second to talk about that too. I don't think we've really discussed a lot of how cards that currently exist change because of Ravnica Allegiance. A card like Settle the Wreckage, on one hand, becomes worse if people are building green-red based decks with stuff like Spellbreaker, right? That's a lot less exciting. But then you have stuff like Rhythm of the Wild that kind of makes you want to play Settle the Wreckage because you're not going to be able to counter as many creatures. You want another way to get rid of them. Also, to that point, there's going to be way more Shocklands in play. So now every deck has the option. Let's say you're playing 3 colors. You can play 24 lands that are either Shocklands or Checklands of some kind. That's pretty significant. So, effectively, your whole mana base, or close to it, depending on how you wish to mix your lands up, may not even have that many basics. So, after the first Settle the Wreckage goes off, you may not even have a lot of basics you can go fetch. So now the downside to Settle the Wreckage doesn't really exist all that much. So, at the end of the day, do opponents want to play Settle the Wreckage or no? I have no idea. Right now, it feels like the answer is probably still yes. And then you just find something else to deal with a guy like Spellbreaker. Because again, they only have 4 Spellbreakers. You're only going to have 3 or 4 Settle the Wreckage. So, I guess that's fair. And if you have something else that deals with creatures, you just save it to target the Spellbreaker, most likely. But, like I said, it'd be interesting to see. As decks get built differently, we don't really know what those are going to look like. And the truth is, maybe the downside to something like Settle the Wreckage doesn't even exist anymore. So it's kind of funny just to think about that type of stuff. We really are going to be changing the format drastically with the cards that are coming out. And I think deck building is going to be exciting. I love when we have all these cards and we don't know what to do with them and we don't know what's going to be the best. And everything's just going to look different. So for some of you that have been coming in and out, we've been covering my favorite top 10 cards from Ravnica Allegiance. So just a quick recap. We obviously have Gruul Spellbreaker. We have the Terramander, which I think is probably one of the more underrated cards. I guess on my list, it's probably the second most underrated of the cards that I have on my top 10. Electro Dominance, which I think is really cool, really fun. It's kind of reminiscent of the Expertise cards that we had from Kaladesh or Aether Revolt. I can't remember which set it was in. But, you get your option to get some damage, and you maybe get a second spell, which is really cool. Priest of Forgotten Gods, which is outstanding. I think this card does a whole lot all on its own, and possibly the best black card in the set. I'll say that with the question mark. But yeah, if somebody wants to quote me on that, that's fine. I think the card is outstanding, and if it finds a home, this is going to be a very, very good card. Rhythm of the Wild, again, outstanding. I think it's doing two really powerful things. I think at the end of the day, it'll just come down to the way the format shapes up, and if this is a card you want more main deck, or if you want in the sideboard. Dovin, Grand Arbiter, I think is also a good card, but again, I don't know the deck it goes in yet, and maybe we have to wait for the best version of the deck to be built around it. I don't know, but it's at least an interesting card and makes you think more than just an auto-include in an Azorius-based deck. Seraph of the Scales, this is my most underrated card in the set. I think the card is fun, it's outstanding. I can see a couple of different versions of decks that are going to be Orzhov-based creature decks that are going to want this. I can see some slower decks that just want some defensive cards playing this. I could even see some that are maybe Rakdos splashing white, to play a card like this. So that's a lot going on. And again, if you're playing something that just sacrifices creatures, this leaves you a few extra tricks you can work with. Thrash, Threats. This is probably the best of the fight-like cards in the set. This doesn't even fight, actually. I have some friends who kind of refer to this as Sucker Punch, that it just deals damage. You don't even fight. But yeah, just the fact that the fight comes at an instant speed, being able to cast Thrash during combat, being able to cast it in response to your opponent tapping out to do stuff is really good. And the fact that if you have no creatures or your opponent has nothing to target, then you just get a 4/4, and that's totally acceptable. Growth Chamber Guardian. This is quickly becoming probably the most talked about and most interesting card in the set. Probably soon to be the 2-drop of choice for most creature-based decks, because either way, you're getting a 2/2 that quickly becomes a 4/4 and lets you go search for another card, or you're going to get some tricks with Riot or other Simic abilities and just turn it into a 3/3 plus and still go get more creatures. So another way for green-based decks to get cards. And the first card on my list that we started the day with was Domri Chaos Bringer, which we have no idea how good it is, but damn if it's not a cool card. And the fact that he's swinging an axe with some boars is just pretty sweet, and it's just really fun art. And I think a lot of people are going to try to play it because the last Domri was so cool and everybody is kind of attached to it. But yeah, I can see some really cool stuff with this. Also, one of the things I failed to point out is if you look at his last ability, the -8, you get an emblem that at the beginning of each end step make a 4/4 red-green beast creature with trample. The interesting thing about it is it's not just during your end step, it's at the end of each end step. So you'll make one on your turn, make one on your opponent's turn. Now you're ready to attack with 8 power worth of creatures. Then you make one on your turn, you make one on your opponent's turn. So it is a relevant ability, and it won't take long to get there. So just something to think about. But that's it. That's my list. That's my top 10. Those are the cards I think are the most entertaining out of Ravnica Allegiance. Those are the ones I'm looking forward to seeing, the ones I'm looking forward to building with. I'm sure everybody else has a different top 10 list. I'd love to hear what your comments are. You can also tell me I'm crazy. I think it'd be great to see how nuts everybody thinks I am for picking the list I did. Or if you thought I picked a bunch of softball cards that are all super easy. I'm good with that too. But that's it. That's my list. So thank you for watching wherever you are. Good afternoon, good